Hello, everyone. We're just going to give it a few seconds and then we will begin. All right. Hello and welcome to our webinar today, brought to you by Anchore in collaboration with RedHat and Bitsea. Today, we'll be talking about SBOMs or BUST, automating compliance for the EU Cyber Resilience Act and beyond. Before I introduce today's speakers, I just have a few housekeeping items to mention. First, all participants' lines are currently in listen-only mode. However, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please drop them in the Q&A or chat panels. We'll be taking questions throughout the webinar, so please don't hesitate to ask them as they come up. We will also have a Q&A portion towards the end. And lastly, today's session is being recorded. We will send out a copy of the recording and the slide deck to everyone afterward. Joining us today, we have a fantastic panel of experts. Alex Rybak, who is the Senior Director of Product Management at Anchore, Dr. Andreas Kotulla, who is the founder and CEO at Bitsea, and Roman Zhukov, responsible for open source security strategy at RedHat. And with that, I'll now hand things over to Alex to kick us off.
All right. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Andreas and Roman, for joining. Both of these folks are very well versed in our topic today. I've worked with Andreas for many years, just met Roman recently, so it should be a good conversation. What we are going to do today is we're going to try to make this information, right? The goal is not to do a lot of marketing, but really give you some tips, takeaways, and help you along your journey with CRA compliance. We're going to do this in 3 parts. So very quickly, we will cover why all this matters, the challenges that are bringing us to this webinar today. Then we'll spend a lot of our time on what are specifically the CRA requirements, what are the deadlines, why this matters, what do you need to do. And then in part 3, which hopefully will be the most educational, is what have folks actually done. So Roman can speak to a software vendor and somebody who is a big player in the open source space on what his organization has done. Andreas can speak to, as a services provider, how he's helped several organizations along their CRA journey. So there will be lots of good learning there. Please ask questions, make them detailed so we can actually answer things that other people likely care about. And hopefully you'll learn something from this webinar here. So I'm going to kick us off here, and what I really want to focus on are a couple of different challenges, which is why we have all these different regulations. So to nobody's surprise, there is a massive security challenge in the world today. This has been going on for many, many years, but we continue to see trends that keep pushing all the numbers up. The first thing we see, and this, you can see the chart in the bottom right there, just the sheer volume of vulnerabilities, and this is just the first quarter of the last 4 years. And you can see year by year, the line keeps bubbling up, right? We're almost triple where we were 3 years ago, and there's absolutely no signs that this pace is going to come down. So why is this happening? Number one, we are seeing that clearly there's an increase in the frequency of attacks, but we also see increase in sophistication. You can see a table there on the top left. There's the well-known supply chain attacks. So these are particularly tricky because your organization may not be the one that is the target of the attack. However, you may be relying on tools, on infrastructure. Let's say there's an attack on GitHub. Maybe your ability to push a PR is blocked, right? Your ability to do a build is blocked. Perhaps you rely on packages from an ecosystem like NPM. And if there are any sort of issues from a security side on NPM, that is going to impact your team. All right, so this is of topmost importance. It doesn't matter if you're the one being targeted or if your company is impacted as a consequence of it. It's something to be mindful of and make sure that you have the processes and tools in place to mitigate these scenarios. The second part, which is almost more important, is just the nature of software development has gone through a major shift in the last couple of years. According to some recent surveys, you can see the sources on the bottom left there, 85% of developers are using AI tools. Personally, I'm thinking it's much, much closer to 100%. But what that does is it changes the nature of how software is written, who's writing it, how many, human eyeballs are on it, what are the processes from the past that may no longer apply or scale, as half of the code written today is in some way AI assisted. So what does that mean? That means that the standard process of a human developer writes code, they're using their expertise, they're running at human pace, which means tools can generally keep up with that. There's then likely one or more human code reviews. Then there's testing by humans. So there's a lot of eyeballs on code. Today, when half of the code is AI assisted, that means we're going at an insane pace. And a lot of these older processes just don't scale. So that means today, as a developer, you are likely running a bunch of agents that all check all the previous agents. Some are generating code, some are code reviewing, some are testing, some are creating defect tickets. And then you have a seasoned developer who is monitoring the process, tweaking the skills definitions, and basically in charge of ensuring that all these agents are doing the right thing. So the kind of the nature of how code is written and the risks that human developed code versus machine developed code are very different. On the flip side, if we look at vulnerabilities, there's, with all the new models coming out, there's lots of AI-assisted vulnerability discovery, which means now on the volume, right, that is exponentially increasing, very sharp upward trend to the disclosure rate and frequency. So as before, the vulnerabilities were identified by humans trying to break things. Today, it's done by models, and they are much more accurate. They create a lot more vulnerabilities. And also, there will obviously be, with more volume, there will be more noise. Right? So the challenge is, how do you shift your process? How do you adjust tooling or bring in new tools to be able to work in this type of volume? Okay. I'll open it up to my guests here. Any specific security issues you want to talk about, anything you've encountered in the past, any tips for our attendees to take away?
I would just like to highlight the Shai-Hulud incident. So overall, there are, as you said, hundreds of new issues that are discovered every day. And it's an amazing speed that new attacks come up and are detected. The Shai-Hulud was a very interesting one because it replicated itself at an amazing speed. And I think within a day, more than 40,000 NPM repositories were affected. And it was just stealing user credentials and passwords and then just getting into the next repository and so on. And if somebody would have used one of these affected repositories, he would automatically put backdoors in his code. And very often when you have automated CI/CD pipelines, all of that happens automatically. So if you always grab the newest version of an NPM package, you would have grabbed the one with the new vulnerability inside. Also, the exec utility attack was a very sophisticated attack, and it was tried to hide it very well. It was just good luck or a coincidence that it was detected, and that would also have opened a backdoor in all of the Linux systems. So that would have been very bad for the infrastructure that we have throughout the globe.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point you made, because there's always been this best practice of, if you've got automated builds, make sure you're up to date, grab the latest release of everything. In this case, that would have actually backfired and put you into more harm's way, right? By not holding out and waiting for something to mature a little bit before you're grabbing the latest release.
Yeah, I would like to underscore the problem actually and share a little bit what we see. We as Red Hat quite obviously working mostly with the Linux and Kubernetes ecosystem, but broadly in the open source. And we do our annual risk reports. There is the link on the slides later on to check it out. For example, our recent one for the previous year, for 2025, we have seen more than 3,000, close to 4,000 security advisories for our products being issued in 2025, and increase in supply chain attacks specifically more than 50%, which is kind of tremendous. Another interesting thing that we noted as an example, we tracked active exploitation of vulnerabilities that were first disclosed years earlier. For one example, a Linux kernel flaw from 2021 that only appears in CISA's known exploited vulnerability catalog in October 2025. So this like a long sleeping thing, right? And I'm pretty much sure we'll see more and more CVs reported this year, and according to different researchers, we can easily cross 50,000, 70,000, and maybe 100,000 the CVs for 2026. So the problem is real.
Yeah, and getting worse.
Okay. One thing to add also is when we look at the some years back, for example, with the Equifax hack, there the vulnerability was detected, and only some months later the company was hacked because they hadn't fixed the issue. Nowadays, we don't have months to look at the vulnerabilities and fix it because there are all these systems automatically checking for the vulnerabilities. So the time you have to fix a vulnerability is rather days or hours and not weeks or months.
Yeah, so that's an important point, right? There's two parts to this. One is identifying it, which hopefully we've gotten better as an industry, but then you have to act. You can't just sit on it and allow the exploitation window to grow. Especially with the supply chain attacks, right? These are not ones that have the same day exposure, right? This is something that's planted long time and then sits around dormant until it actually kicks off and impacts somebody. So you need to make sure that you have collaboration in your organizations between the teams that are identifying this, how to communicate this back to your engineering teams, making sure this is treated with the same urgency as a P1 bug would be and addressed in a systematic fashion, right? This can't be a one-time deal. It's got to be part of your culture of your teams. Okay, so flipping the page. So number one, obviously challenges security. Number two is the regulations are complicated. There's a lot of them, right? You can see here, we got a few boxes around the world. We're going to focus on CRA today, but this is just a tiny slice of all the different regulations out there. Furthermost, if you look at various industry-specific non-cybersecurity regulations, so automotive safety and others, well, they have now kind of crossed the line to include cybersecurity as part of theirs, right? So you can't only look at cybersecurity, you have to look at what industry are you in, what countries are you selling to, what products do you build, what is the likelihood of those products to harm somebody, and there will be regulations for things like medical devices, automotive, airplanes, and so forth. So that's kind of the challenge, right? The good thing is that if you look across a lot of these, there's lots of common things, right? So number one, all these regulations in some way talk about having an accurate inventory of what you're using, right? If you don't know what packages you have, the relationships between them, then clearly you can't secure them. That means that very often you're going to have either implied or directly required SBOM requirements. So we will talk about that. We'll talk about why the SBOM is a really important tool that can help you deal with these things and is an input into the entire process. So again, like if you don't have a catalog, then it's really hard for you to figure out if you're impacted by the latest thing in the news. The third thing that a lot of them talk about is just managing third-party risk, including open source, right? So it can't just be scanning your own code. It can't be only, runtime pen testing. You have to look at all three elements, right? Everything that's coming in that your team didn't build, everything your team is building, and then how does the product actually function when it's deployed? Because the nature of these things, may vary between pre-deployment and post-deployment. The fourth thing that a lot of these talk about is obviously now that you know what packages you have, you need to be able to identify their security issues and address them, right? So have a continuous process to identify vulnerabilities, patch them, continuously monitor for new vulnerabilities, which is the most important, especially in things that are deployed to production, and then tracking and record keeping. And then ultimately, the reason you do all of these things is because all these regulations have disclosure and reporting requirements, some with financial consequences if you don't do it. And you can't meet these very aggressive reporting windows if you haven't done all the bullets above. So we'll focus on the CRA, but a lot of the things that we talk about apply to other areas and other regulations. So definitely find out, number one, which ones are relevant to your organization. And number two, what is unique about all these that may require you to do additional things in these base items. Okay, I'll hand it over to colleague there.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, so all of these regulations are meant to increase cybersecurity and to limit cybersecurity risks. And if we look especially at the European ones like DORA, CRA, or NIST2, they all have this risk management at their core. And the risk management, to do that thoroughly, you always need to know what is in your software. So exactly what you said, Alex. You need to know all the different components that are in there. You need to have an SBOM, and then you need to check it regularly. And that's part of all of these regulations. Often mentioned explicitly, sometimes implicitly. You need the SBOM.
Right. I would like to add a little bit the bigger picture here. As I work with the CRA on almost daily basis, I frequently get the question from people outside, from our customers, and just from other manufacturers and from companies like, okay, the CRA is here, and now what? Right? How is it different from the GDPR, even NIST or DORA, like PCI DSS, and then the understanding was like, okay, we're going to be compliant anyway, right? Like you mentioned, Andreas, and you, Alex, checking the boxes and etc. But the CRA specifically, since this is the topic of the day for us today at this webinar, is different because of the following things. First of all, it is really outcome based, right? It focuses on the results rather than on obligations. So it both regulates the process, how you need to develop your products, right? Their life cycle, but also you need to do conformity assessment, and you need to make sure that products are secure and free from vulnerabilities and have this CE mark, right? They perform the conformity assessment. So the outcome, it is no longer possible to say, hey, I am certified with the 27,000 and, you know, therefore I'm good. So you need to be rigorous for each of your products that you put on the market. The second important thing about the CRA, it's tightly connected to the specific European legislation landscape, which consists of NLF, a new legislative framework. It uses CE marking, as I mentioned, which is now mandatory for all the products with digital elements, and that includes both hardware devices and software alike, right? And also it applies harmonized standards for compliance. Therefore, we have the standards being developed right now here in Europe to actually help manufacturers to be compliant with the CRA. And also it's heavily linked to the PLD. We have this acronym on the page as well. This is EU Product Liability Directive. That means if poor security leads to defective product, for example, for users, for your customers, it may trigger the liability, which goes beyond the normal fines, right? Because it potentially harms people. And finally, the CRA has really massive scope, right? It is applicable horizontally for everything, right? As I mentioned, for devices, hardware, but for software as well, if it's sold for money, if it's put on the market. And also, CRA, the first in its kind, recognizes the open source as the critical piece, as the criticality of open source ecosystem in general. And this is really brand new in the regulation worldwide, and it needs to be taken in account by manufacturers that are consuming open source, because there are requirements how you need to ingest securely your open source and make sure it's free from vulnerabilities. So that's why the CRA is so complex, so important.
All right, perfect. So Roman gave us an intro into it. Let me turn it over to Andreas to walk us through some key requirements and key dates for the CRA.
Yeah, so if we look at the CRA, we at Bitsea, we are very much involved in the CRA. We got rewarded a big project from the European Union to make it, to develop tool chains to make it easier for companies to implement all the obligations that you have for the CRA. And what is important to note is that the CRA is relevant for all digital products that somehow talk to the internet. Soon as you have some product, even temporarily. If you have a product that can has an app or somewhere talks to some other component, then most likely it falls under the CRA. And it has been enforced since 2024. It will require full compliance by the end of 2027. And we have seen several customers who mentioned, it's still 1.5 years to go. But it's important to note in the middle, you see September 11th, 2026. At this point in time, you need to report if there are any critical security vulnerabilities in your product that can be exploited. So that's only a couple of months from now. And until then, you should know exactly what is in your product, and you need to regularly check your SBOM and all the components. Are there new critical security vulnerabilities? And then you need to report them. So that is very soon, and companies who are not yet prepared, they need to hurry to meet this deadline. If we look at the key obligations, so there are many, and I have tried to put them in 4 big groups. There are first some product requirements, and the basic one is you should not ship products that have known security vulnerabilities. So you need to have some method or process implemented where you can ensure that you regularly check for security vulnerabilities and get rid of them before you ship. And cybersecurity, you cannot just have it at the end of your product development. It needs to be part of your whole development cycle. So when you start developing a product, you also need to think, how could an attacker misuse this product, or how could he break in there and do something unintended? And all of that needs to be documented right from the beginning. So this is the second bullet point in the product requirements. Cybersecurity has to be part of the design and development process. You need to ensure that you have a secure configuration. So you cannot ship all your products, for example, with the initial pin all set to 1, 2, 3, 4. Because then you do not have a secure default configuration. It needs to be individual for each of the devices that you deliver. And the cybersecurity is always, you need to ensure this confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And for that, you need to do a risk assessment and also document that, where you have basically this risk vector and you document what are the possible use cases or scenarios, how an attacker could come into your product and somehow produce harm of it.
Andreas, quick question for you here. So obviously, if you're building greenfield, right, I'm building a new product, then fantastic. There's best practices, frameworks to do this. What do people do that have 20-year-old products where this wasn't the initial thought? Right now, security is being bolted on a couple of decades later.
Yes.
Any tips on how organizations can manage that process?
Yeah, sure. So if you do not sell this product anymore, like if it's in the field and you just support, you don't need to change, then there's no impact on you. However, if you are still actively selling that product, then you need to comply with the CRA. Then you need to look at the whole process.
Got it. So no exemptions, old product, new product, doesn't matter. You have to go back and make sure that it's secure.
If you still sell it. And that also implies like you have a product with software version X and you have a major new release which you sell into the market after December 11, then the full compliance is required. As long as you just have bug fixes or small fixes, then you can stay with the old product. That's also one reason why you should start looking into this now, because when you plan that your product will be shipped after December 2027, then you need to make sure that you have all the obligations met. Did I answer that question, Alex?
Yes.
Yeah. Then we have the one big group, how you handle requirements and vulnerabilities. It's very important that you do these security reviews. You again need to document that, and you need to provide patches for security vulnerabilities. And that can be quite complicated. The patches always need to be free of charge, and you need to somehow inform all your users that there is a security patch. That is more easy if you have a product where you can just do an over-the-air application of the patch. It's more difficult if you have an embedded product where it's more difficult for the user or customer to install the patches himself. So you need to think about that, how you can do that. And you also need to have these security patches for products at least 5 years after the end of life of your product. So that's quite a long time. And you somehow need to see how you can support that. The third pillar is the components in the supply chain. And here it's very important that you do not only look at your own code, but all the code that you put in the product. And we have seen with many customers, they like took a Linux system and a database and some other stuff, and they just added a couple of 100 lines of code. Suddenly for the Cyber Resilience Act, you need to make sure that the whole software does not contain security issues. And you need to be able to patch all of that. And you need to look at your whole supply chain. So all your suppliers, they need to comply to all of that as well. And we had recently an interesting show or presentation in the US, where some people were asking, I do not sell to Europe. Why should I care about the CRA? And then we quickly found out that they are very well part of the supply chain. So their product will be integrated in something which will be integrated in another component, and that is sold in the European market. And suddenly they are under the CRA as well, if they want their software to be sold in Europe. So that's something important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and that's a huge point, because even if you're not in the supply chain and 6 months from now your company decides to open up a new market, this is a revenue impedance here. So you want to make sure that you're not blocking yourself from parts of the world from future sales by ignoring certain regulations. Very good point.
And also for the supply chain, all the obligations you have in your contracts with your suppliers, you should check that you have some statements that they also respond to you if you have a request regarding the CRA. If you have a security vulnerability which is in the code of your supplier, he needs to fix it quickly. And for the last pillar, the minimum information that you need to provide, your users need to have a point of contact where they can report vulnerabilities. So you need to have that on your website or on some product documentation. And your product needs to be easily identifiable. The customer needs to know which version do I have, which type is it. And also important, the intended use. We have seen sometimes that the end customer uses a product totally different from the intended use. And so you just need to make sure that it is secure in the intended use that you have documented somewhere. And what is also important with this handling of the vulnerabilities is you need to report active exploited vulnerabilities within 24 hours to the bodies, like in Europe it's the ENISA or in Germany. And that's a very short time frame. So within these 24 hours, you need to understand, is it a critical attack? And is it exploitable in your product? And then you need to report. And then within 72 hours, you need to provide a workaround or a solution. And within 3 months, you need to provide a final fix. So, but that is very short, and you need to set up your processes that you can handle that. So from the time that somebody reports the problem to you and you get aware of it until the time that you react, report it, and have a first fix, all these processes should be very well lined up.
Yeah, okay. So I want to dig into this last point because this is super difficult, right? So the SEC and the US Security Exchange Commission had similar reporting guidelines, and typically the companies that are complying with this are, Clorox, MGM, like huge organizations with hundreds of thousands of employees. So by far the most important first step before you even do anything here is, how do you report, right? Who's responsible at your company? It's not going to be the developer writing an email or submitting something. It's going to have to go through some sort of formal process. So if you're a startup with 30 people, you can all huddle up on a Zoom call and figure it out. If you work for a large organization, you have to understand what your team has to do. because as Andreas mentioned, 24 hours, super tight. It may take you most of that time just to identify something and figure out what to report, but make sure that ahead of time you understand the process, how you go about doing it, and make sure that the process itself doesn't ding you versus the data that has to be part of the report to NIST or other bodies.
And with these 24 hours, we sometimes hear that it is unfair or it's so quick, nobody can react in that time. On the other hand, it's always a race between the companies that produce products and the attackers. And with that 24 hours, the intention is that it is that everybody is informed that there is this vulnerability, that everybody can react very quick. And so it's a good thing that there is this very quick information chain. On the other hand, it's just difficult to do.
Yeah, so the other thing to note is if you are a software buyer, like pay attention to these reports, right? Because the software producer is reporting into a database, but if nobody's following that database, then there's not a lot of value to this information, right? So if you're relying on people's software and they're part of EU and CRA compliance, make sure that you've got a team who's paying attention so that you can mitigate it on your end as a user of that software. All right, so we talked about the requirements. Let's talk about kind of the most important tool as part of this process, without which it's very difficult to have the knowledge to be able to run the process. So obviously talking about the SBOM, so I assume at this point everybody knows what an SBOM is, but think of it as the ingredients label for your software. It is a machine-readable industry standard format document that will identify all of the contents inside software applications, their relationships, what licenses govern their use, and then typically will come with a compendium security report that will explain which vulnerabilities matter and which ones do not. There are 4 things that are critically important to be able to do, and the SBOM helps you do that. So the first one is, as we mentioned earlier, there's a requirement in all these regulations about transparency and just knowledge of what is inside your product. An SBOM is an agreed upon kind of industry standard way to do this and to document it. Make sure that you are building SBOMs for every one of your products. If you don't have the budget for a commercial tool, go to Anchore, download SIFT. It's a free scanner. There should be no excuse. Everybody should be able to have an SBOM for every piece of code that they either write or deploy as part of their product. There's lots of tools out there. This is a very low level of burden to be able to produce an SBOM. The quality of the SBOM, that's a different issue, right? So there you have to make sure that there's some sort of sanity testing on your end to ensure that the SBOM you produce is actually complete and accurate. And most importantly is continue to do this, right? Don't produce one SBOM a year. Every time you do a build, every time you assemble a product, every time you deploy, make sure that at some regular frequency you are refreshing your SBOMs and don't throw away the old ones, because at some point an auditor is going to come in and ask, how have you done the last 6 months? And diffing SBOMs is a really good way to kind of show how the composition of your product's changing over time. Which leads us into source of truth, right? The SBOM and whatever system is holding that data becomes your organization's source of truth. It is your inventory of everything. Today, there's lots of heterogeneous environments. There's lots of mixed code from different places, some old, some new. So cataloging all that, understanding who's the owner behind all these different pieces is critically important. Again, if you got 24 hours to report something, you can't spend that time discovering what you have, right? All this has to be done ahead of time to enable you to comply. Vulnerability management, that is sitting on top of the SBOM, right? Without knowing what packages you have, it's very difficult to build a list of vulnerabilities and assess their impact, because again, you have to know what is causing that exposure, which is going to come from the packages that are pulled into your product, along with the code that your developers write themselves. And then most importantly is you got to assess 0 days. You got to be able to report if you find active issues in your product, and you need to have a corpus of data to search to be able to get to this information. So again, at the heart, everything is all about the SBOM. Make sure you run them. There's lots of tools out there. Make sure this just becomes a standard part of your engineering process. Don't only do this when you're ready to ship a product and generate the SBOM at that point. It'll give you a lot of insights and lots of data to be able to run all these other processes. Any comments from either one on this? I know this is near to all the processes that we run. So
Yeah, of course, we love SBOMs at Red Hat. I want to provide a few comments on that. Quite obviously, the tools are super important to comply with the CRA. We at this point well know that the SBOMs themselves is the requirement, but as Andreas pointed out, it is super critical actually to make your vulnerability management actionable, because without this, it's kind of doesn't make sense. You just wouldn't be able to keep up with all the vulnerabilities and reports and obligations and etc. And it's super important for us. We have been doing SBOMs for quite some time now. We actually openly publish SBOMs for our products, and you can check them out along with additional security metadata such as VEX files to make sure we provide the accurate statements, what components are affected and why not. So this is again very important, and there is no matter of the system which NIST, European Cybersecurity Agency, will put in place for manufacturers to report under the CRA. You need this right now in your organization to be able to react within the tight timelines, and also to be able to deliver this accurate information and confidence to your own customers, right? So that's why SBOMs are really central to the security operations in general, but also quite instrumental for the CRA as well.
Okay, so we've covered the challenges, we talked about the regulations and the requirements. Let's go to where hopefully you get most of the learning is, well, what have our organizations actually done, right? Are there steps here that you can repeat, hopefully short circuit some of your process? So we'll start with Roman talking about Red Hat. And so Red Hat is interesting, right? They're a software provider. They're also a huge player in the open source community. They set a lot of standards, best practices. So this should be interesting as far as what is Red Hat doing around CRA and how you can learn from the work that they have done.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share our journey. It's been a long one, and it's not simple, but we from the very beginning we treated the CRA compliance as not a checkbox for us, rather the foundational exercise that we want to take and kind of elevate even our that we think a very good security posture. And Alex, you are right. We are holding a lot of roles under the CRA. We're quite obviously a manufacturer because we sell our software for money, something like RHEL operating system or OpenShift hybrid platforms or AI platforms at the moment. But then we also open source software steward, the specific entity that introduced in the CRA in order to recognize the foundations and companies that support open source software but don't sell them for money. In our case, it would be Fedora operating system or Ansible automation platform that are available for free and completely open source for everybody. Manufacturers and stewards have different obligations. The 90% of obligations are for manufacturers, but stewards still need some work to be done. And finally, of course, we are contributing and maintainer a lot of open source. It's all around the Linux world, but also otherwise, right? There's thousands of Red Hatters contribute and maintain a lot of packages out there. If you can click next, Alex, please. Yes. So, and that's why, as I mentioned, we took it very seriously. We have our CRA program established, I think, a year and a half ago, roughly. And it spans over 8 work streams, all the way from awareness to direct engagement with youth standardization bodies and upstream communities, as they really need support to make sure they survive, actually, because early versions of the CRA were quite harmful for the open source community in general. Then, of course, we need to satisfy manufacturer obligations and steward obligations under the CRA. Vulnerability management and the incident response, one of the core and most important and most challenging obligations. We spin out the work stream for this as well. And then conformity assessment, data collection, and legal, of course. The bottom line here is, if you want to run your CRA program and make it seriously, you just can't leave it up to the one single department, like say information security or legal or open source office or whatever. It should be cross-department exercise because it involves so many things and it affects your roadmaps, it affects everything, right? And for us, therefore, it's really a strategic investment and not just a compliance. We really wanted to elevate or rather leverage our multi-year experience, leading experience in security to make sure our customers can rely on 100% compliant software, right, that we provide in them as a supplier, but also kind of help them to navigate their own compliance needs, whether for CRA or for other obligations. If you can advance, yes. The vulnerability part, as I mentioned, one of the most challenging obligation. Andreas already mentioned there are highly tight timelines, 24 hours initial reporting to NIST and to local European CSORTs. And this is super critical, and that's why SBOM and VEX, as I mentioned previously, come to play quite nicely because they allow auditable process for us to actually manage all of those thousands of packages and everything at scale and at the quality that is acceptable, and that gives us an opportunity really to make sure we reporting in time and we reporting for those things that really matters, that's really critical, that's really actively exploited. So we really focusing on these parts as well, which already mentioned, powered by SBOM and security metadata. And the other part, it is actually quite important. We are taking the stance on responsible open source stewardship. I mentioned that the CRA recognizes the not only existence of the open source ecosystem. Imagine really this is the first time when you can see the open source mentioned as a critical piece in the regulation. Right? Finally, we got the recognition for something that powers everything around us, right? From Linux to everything else. So we are quite serious about this, and we are proud to shape European standards and implementation documents that are now being developed under the EU authorities to make sure that the rules and standards and specifications kind of make sense and applicable both to manufacturers, to all of us, but also to the open source ecosystem, and kind of make sense to the open source projects themselves. And therefore, we have been always open source first. As you, Alex, mentioned, we contribute a lot to open source, right? We take a leadership in the communities under the different foundations to actually drive these activities. And this is free to join for everybody. If you want to learn what's happening with the CRA connection with open source, just come and join us. Free, no registration requirement typically. So yes, we are championing security in projects like Fedora and Ansible. You may have heard about this little piece, but also go beyond this, right? To make sure we really improve security posture, leveraging CRA as the compliance piece, of course, but really we strive to be focused on the security improvements of the projects and products that we support. So that's our journey.
Perfect. Thank you, Roman. I'll just double back on the point you made in the beginning, which is if you look at all the boxes on top, right, go figure that out for your company. This can't be a single person responsible. You never know where the issue will arise, so it has to be coordinated, and it has to flow all the way through to product, to roadmaps. You have to make room in your roadmap to get better over time. So that this requires all the stakeholders to work together. So go form the Tiger team. All right, so we're going to now flip this. So we've heard from RedHat. Now let's hear from Bitsea. So Andreas can talk about what does it look like from supporting others and going through the journey and achieving CRA compliance. So Andreas, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so as you may have seen, the complying to all the obligations from the CRA is not easy. It's a challenge, and but it's good to get secure and safe products. And the European Union does not leave the manufacturers alone. So they had many calls for proposals on how to make it easier. I just posted one link. There is this Octet EU, that was the open source project that we contributed to. And that the 5 steps that you see here, they are based on the outcome of that project. And from this project, you get for free first an assessment to find out, are you affected at all? So this is number 1. On this webpage, you will get some questionnaires you can just click through, and then at the end, it will tell you you are affected by the CRA or you are not affected. It also contains a gap analysis, so it asks you for all the different security measurements and the processes that you use to produce your product, and at the end, it will tell you how good you reach the CRA requirements already. So you have that assessment. And as said, all of that is for free. You can just go to the webpage and go through the questionnaires. As we have discussed, one of the critical parts is getting this SBOM. And to get a good and complete SBOM, that's quite difficult. For that, we also have a tool chain. It's based on an open source product called ORD. And one part which takes the most effort is the curations. So these tools will give you some hints which components could be in your supply chain and in your own code. It will give you a list of components and then many indicators. And you, as a user, need to just check and say, yeah, that's true, or that's a false positive. And for many customers or many companies, this is difficult to do because they are not experts in that. And the toolchain, it's AI enhanced. It will take most of the work for you and do it. And at the end, you get an SBOM. It's automatically then produces the BECs, and that you can use to do your risk assessment. And you can monitor your risk of the software product. So what we have developed is a whole training around that and a whole process around that. So we have a crash course telling the customers what do they need to do, what are all the obligations, and we sit together with all the relevant teams and the stakeholders like procurement, legal team, software development, security. And we just distribute the tasks that need to be done in each company and can develop a project plan to get CRA ready. And for that, we have ready-made processes which need to adapt it for each companies. We have templates for all the different documentation that needs to be done that is required by the CRA. And of course, the risk analysis, we help with that. And altogether, we call that the CRA Guardian. And on the page, you find a link with some further information on that tool. So it will help you to get ready, to get started, and it helps you to identify the gap. And then we can help you to close these gaps to get CRA ready.
So for somebody who is late to the party here and just realizing that they've got a couple months to get going, what's the first thing you would recommend somebody do to start?
Well, first you need to assess if you're affected at all. And the good thing in the CRA is the European Union does not want that you have this double obligation for several of these regulations. So it's either CRA or maybe you fall under the NIST 2 or you fall under some healthcare regulations. Or there are some technical guidelines for the automotive industry. So you first need to see, is the CRA applicable for me or not? Or do I fall under some other obligation? Then the second one, before you get started, you need to do this gap analysis to see most of the companies, they have some parts in place already. Maybe just some documentation is missing or some processes are missing. And once you know the gaps, then you can work on a project plan and do the rest.
Okay, perfect. And yes, I will echo Roman's post. Please ask questions on anything we've covered or any topics you have around CRA or general compliance. I'm more than happy to dig into those. Okay, so I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Anchore a little bit. So let me just spend a couple minutes here, talk about the tool side of this. So as mentioned, the core element to running any sort of compliance program is just knowledge about what is inside your product. We earlier this week announced a new version 6 of Anchore Enterprise. This is our commercial offering that will help you organize all the work that you do into applications versions, generate unified SBOMs, generate VEX documents, which are all the different tools that have been mentioned by both of our panelists that are really critical to getting, number one, CRA compliant, but even more importantly, to give your customers transparency into the software that they're paying you for, as well as not overburden their security teams by chasing every vulnerability, which is where VEX comes in, and your team can explain to them which ones matter, which ones don't for the products that you ship. You're the expert in your products. VEX is a great tool to be able to pass along a compendium document with the SBOM explaining what are true positives and false positives with any sort of scanning that your customers may do of your software. You'll see a QR code on top there. Please register. I'm going to host a webinar June 4th, a release webinar where we'll talk about all the new capabilities in the product. If you're new to this, if you want to test drive, we've got a couple open source projects, SIFT and Gripe. SIFT is an SBOM generator. Gripe is a security scanner, over 50 million downloads combined. Please go to GitHub, check it out. Again, there's no excuse for not having an SBOM these days. Tons of tools out there. If you can't find one, use ours. And give us a call. Happy to help you on your journey as well. Okay, so I realized I completely forgot to mention that there will be some polls that may have popped up. So if our attendees saw polls and you answer them, we will go through results. Oh, there we go. Here's the poll. So as I go through the takeaways, please complete these. And we will get a sense of, from our attendees, what does it look like with respect to those 3 questions. So while you're doing the polls, let's go through the key takeaways. So number 1, and this is kind of what Andreas just mentioned, is understand whether you're impacted, if you have obligations under CRA, if your product falls into the category that requires you to go through the certification. Second step is understand your product classification. There are products that require third-party certification. There are products that require you to self-certify. There's different kind of gradients of how much work you have to do. So make sure you are clear on what that is, so you are not under or over, doing work to comply with the CRA. And all of this is published. Use Andreas' site to get all the templates and the rules. Understand what you have to do. That's number 1. Number 2, and I've mentioned this several times, please build SBOMs for everything that you do. There's free tools, there's paid tools. Every ecosystem has a tool. Anchore supports importing SBOMs. So if you run a bunch of different SBOMs across different ecosystems and you're looking for a platform to put them all together, give us a shot. We can import them all, normalize them to duplicate, and you will get one view of your entire product. Number 3, probably the most important, is don't have somebody manually doing this on Fridays. Automate it, integrate it, make this part of your process. Every pipeline that you have should have a gate that is about composition and making sure that you are vetting your packages. You're looking at your security vulnerabilities that come from that effort, and that you have processes to either fail builds, automatically create tickets, or at a minimum, identify a developer who gets a report that says, based on the build, here's all the security issues. And then make sure that you have policies in place to be able to capture this automatically, because again, you don't want the hit by bust factor really impacting your company. So have all this documented, have it all integrated, make sure you train your teams on tools and processes. This should not be a mystery to anybody. Everybody should understand at your organization how you go about doing this and working towards compliance. 4th, talked about as well, find out how you're going to report and who's responsible and how information flows across your company, who kicks it off, who's spearheading and coordinating work. I've been part of several responses where there's a security vulnerability identified in a product I managed. There's 20 people involved to coordinate a response, to make sure it's compliant with your company policies, make sure it's going through the proper channels. So plan this ahead of time. You've got 24 hours. Do not waste them on this step, right? But do this before you start. And then the other part that's really important, this kind of goes to Andreas's first column, is make sure you have thought about your vulnerability disclosure process, right? This may be for CRA, may also be to all your customers, maybe to partners, if you're part of the supply chain, it's your downstream customers that are then selling products to end customers. Have this written down, think through how you're going to do it, who's responsible, what format you're going to use, what information you're going to provide. Make sure you have a PCERT website that tells your customers how to report vulnerabilities back to you. So all of these things are part of planning and coordinating ahead of time so that when something happens, right, you just run your process. It's not a fire drill, and you work within the rules and procedures that you have set up. I'm happy to get both of your guys' feedback or any other takeaways that you want to talk about here.
I think Alex, you captured it right. Just the red line across everything. Don't wait. Start now. Right? It's so complicated, as Andreas pointed out, and we all know that everything is in flux. The standards are not ready, and still some of the clarifications we are waiting from the EU authorities. But you can't afford yourself just to sit and wait until everything is done. Start your journey right now. Understand your roles, understand your classification, and use the tools. There anyway will help you.
Okay, perfect. So happy to take questions. There was a question that came in on LinkedIn a few days ago when we were promoting this. I want to make sure I at least answer that one first. And the question was about how to achieve continuous compliance without overhead. So I think we talked about all the different elements, but the short answer is you need the process, right? It can't be manual. So encode your compliance requirements into policies. Make sure you have live SBOMs that are continuously updated, continuously assessed. You want to shift enforcement as far left as you can. Make sure you have policy gates and triggers on things like your build pipelines, deployment gates. Once you're in production, make sure you're monitoring and you have automatic monitoring tools. There's lots of vendors that will do security monitoring in production, including Anchore. So make sure that all of this, your teams are educated, the tools are in place, everything is automated, and then run continuously, improve your process. The final thing kind of on the output side is, alert fatigue, right? Everybody's seen this. There's a million different tickets. There's a million vulnerabilities. Which ones matter? So use a scoring algorithm. We have a thing called Anchore Score, which will combine CVSS score, severity, VEX, and EPSS. If that is not your flavor, then come up with some algorithm that works for you. Which factors matter the most to you, and make sure that you're not just looking at the vulnerability score, but additional factors that will break ties between many vulnerabilities that may have the same score. And then have exceptions to your policies, right? You don't want to bring engineering to a grinding halt every time a critical vulnerability pops up. So make sure that there's ways that you can give them X number of days to fix it without nagging with alerts, that things are assessed and you don't have developers pulled off of work to address a new vulnerability that maybe isn't even exposed in your application. So make sure you consider all these things as part of building the process, so you're working on things that matter in a continuous manner. Let's see if we have any other questions there.
Yeah, there was a couple that came in through the chat. I think this one relates to you, Andreas. Your 5-step process looks great on paper, but realistically, how many months should a mid-sized company budget to go from step 1 to full compliance?
So as you have seen, there are quite many things to do and to set up. And one of the items that takes the most effort is the software composition analysis. So producing the SBOM and to get that, and also to line up all your suppliers, and also they need to set up all the processes so that you can be compliant to the CRA. I would at least estimate half a year to 9 months, 6 to 9 months, I think is a reasonable time frame that you should allocate to set up your CRA readiness.
Brilliant, thank you. And Roman, there's one here for you. What happens under the CRA if you find a vulnerability in an open source package that we use, but the original maintainer has completely abandoned it?
That's the amazing question, and the quite real one. I'm going to be blunt, right? Under the CRA, you own the problem entirely. So that's now your problem. The CRA just doesn't give your a free pass, right? And say, hey, if anything, a third party, including open source, is abandoned, you have no liability. Quite opposite, right? If you embed your code in your commercial product and place it in the EU market, the CRA legally treats that is your dependency or your code eventually. So you need to perform the regular due diligence against it. And ultimately, you need to fix the vulnerability effects in your product with upstream help or not. Now, I think you have several options how to approach it. Fork and patch, of course. Then the second one, as they call it, rip and replace, right? To replace to something else. Then you can try to obtain the commercial end of life support from somebody else to support this dependency. But I wouldn't be open source supporter if I wasn't suggest the better option. Better idea is to reach out to the maintainer or to the steward of these components and offer help, see what's happening, offer help to keep the project alive if it's not too late, and first try to fix the root cause why it's going to be abandoned. And finally, the bottom line here, the CRA requires you to maintain SBOM, right? And it's your perfect chance actually to spot some of these things early in the cycle. If you have the accurate SBOM, you probably can use it to continuously evaluate your third-party dependencies, including those open source, and track end-of-life cycles and track, the recent releases activity, so that you're not surprised and prepared with these CV hits to the abandoned components well in advance. So SBOM could be helpful here as well.
I have one short addition to that. If you look at the SBOM, that should be one part of your risk analysis to assess for each of the components if they are still alive or if they are not maintained anymore. And at that point in time, you should decide, do I really want to use that component? And then you need to train your own development team to be able to maintain it or find somebody who can do it, or you can just replace the component. But of course, you should do that beforehand and not when an incident happens.
100%.
Yeah, and I'll close with a little analogy. I've been using this for probably 15 years now. Is if you think about an airplane, right? So Boeing, Airbus, whatever, right? If something ever happens, nobody talks about who built the subassembly, right? That's for them to figure out. The logo in the news is going to be who sells the product into the market. And then it's their problem under the CRA to unravel where this problem came from, right? So by using somebody's code, you're assuming ownership and responsibility for it. So make sure, again, your processes are tuned to do that. Again, during our webinar, I'll talk about what we're doing about end-of-life identification. So we can talk about that in the next webinar. So thank you for joining. There's some resources available on the slide here. Please, we'll share the slides. So please click through, download the resources, and it'll help you along the way.
Thank you for listening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our presenters, and thank you to everyone for joining. Apologies we went over, and we hope to see you next time. Enjoy the rest of your day.